Okay, so are you ready to dive in?
Always. I love this stuff, especially this era, the rise of new states in Africa.
So much going on now.
It's huge, like globally impactful. And you've given us some amazing sources for this deep dive.
Yeah, we're really lucky to have them. I
Mhm.
think it's easy to get bogged down with all the dates and names, but we're going deeper here.
We're going for the how and the why.
Exactly. The movements, the challenges. I mean, even just looking at the objectives for this unit of study, you get a sense of just how complex it all was.
Absolutely.
Like right off the bat, understanding the different national movements that led to independence. I mean, were we talking about peaceful protests and diplomacy?
Hmm.
Or was it more about armed uprisings?
Well, it's interesting because it was such a mix. You really can't generalize. Each nation's path to independence was so unique.
Right. And I guess those different approaches probably had a lot to do with this specific colonial power they were dealing with, right?
Oh, absolutely. The relationship between the colony and the colonizer, the internal dynamics within each African nation, it all played a part.
Okay, so give me an example. Like, how do things play out in a place like Ghana?
Well, Ghana's a really interesting case. You had Kwame Nkrumah, an incredibly charismatic and strategic leader. He managed to kind of weave this path between pushing for independence, but doing it through organization and negotiation.
So more of a political maneuvering kind of thing.
Yeah, he was a master at building coalitions, mobilizing the population, but ultimately he got the British to the negotiating table.
Wow. So a very different picture from, say, Algeria.
Oh, absolutely. Algeria was a completely different story. I mean, you're talking about a long and brutal war for liberation against the French.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. The intensity of the fighting, the atrocities committed on both sides.
It was a tragic chapter, but it highlights just how differently these independence movements unfolded.
And, thinking about those movements, you can't help but think about the leaders.
Oh, absolutely. Larger than life figures.
Like Nkrumah, like you mentioned, but also people like Nelson Mandela in South Africa.
Right. But it's interesting because even though they both fought for independence, their visions were quite different.
Like how so?
Well, Nkrumah, he was this passionate Pan-Africanist. He really believed in a united Africa, one continent working together. But Mandela, dealing with the horrors of apartheid in South Africa, his priority was dismantling that system within his own country.
That makes sense. I mean, how could you focus on continental unity when you have such a pressing issue right in front of you?
Exactly. It was about priorities, about context.
So even with that shared goal of independence, the how was a really complicated question.
It was, and, it didn't get any easier once these nations achieved independence.
That's right. The objectives point to all these challenges that emerged, like what were some of the biggest hurdles these new states had to face?
So imagine you've just inherited a country, but the whole system, the economy, the infrastructure, it's all designed to benefit a foreign power.
Yeah, I see where you're going with this.
That's what so many of these nations faced. This deep economic dependence. I mean, you look at a country like Zambia, rich in resources like copper.
But the profits weren't going back to the people.
Exactly. They were still largely flowing out to former colonial companies, so gaining control of their own resources, that was a massive challenge.
Yeah, talk about starting off on the back foot.
Exactly. And then you layer on top of that political instability, coups, and even civil wars in some cases. It was a lot to navigate.
That's a lot to process, honestly. To think about these leaders trying to build a nation while also dealing with these intense pressures, both internal and external.
Yeah. But the objectives also talk about efforts to overcome these challenges. Right?
Exactly. They didn't just give up. What were some of the ways these nations tried to forge their own path?
Well, you see a lot of nations turning to socialist models, trying to nationalize industries.
So basically taking control of their own economic destinies.
Exactly. And then on the political front, a lot of it was about nation building, creating a sense of unity, a shared identity.
Wow. Like how? What did that look like in practice?
Well, one example is Tanzania under Julius Nyerere. He champions Swahili as a national language.
Trying to bridge those ethnic divides.
Yeah, create those common threads to bind people together.
That's fascinating. And speaking of connecting to the wider world, the next objective talks about those external factors.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how much did the global landscape of the time affect things?
Oh, it's impossible to separate the rise of these new states from the backdrop of the Cold War. It played a huge role.
Right, because suddenly you have these superpowers vying for influence.
And Africa became this battleground for their ideological struggles. So you have these proxy conflicts popping up, like the Soviet Union would back one faction in a civil war, and the U.S. would back another. It was a mess.
Yeah, Angola comes to mind. That was a brutal, decades-long conflict fueled by Cold War rivalries.
Exactly. It's like independence just shifted who was pulling the strings.
But at the same time, I guess it gave these new nations some leverage, right?
Oh, absolutely. They weren't just pawns in this game. They could play the superpowers against each other, negotiate, play for concessions, you know?
I mean, it sounds risky.
It was. But it was a reality they had to deal with.
And that's where those last two objectives come in, about really diving into specific case studies and regional examples.
Because it's one thing to talk about these broad trends, but the real insights come from looking at individual cases, comparing and contrasting.
Seeing how the story played out differently in different places.
Right. Like, how is the experience of independence in Ethiopia with its ancient imperial history different from, say, Mozambique, where they fought tooth and nail against Portuguese rule?
So it's about understanding the whole tapestry, not just the individual threads.
Exactly.
And lastly, there's that objective about using this history to foster a sense of patriotism. What do you think about that?
I think, it's not about blind nationalism. It's about understanding the complexities of your nation's past, the struggles, the triumphs, the mistakes, and how all of that shapes the present.
Yeah. It's about having a deeper, more informed sense of patriotism.
Exactly.
And that's what makes this period of history so important to study. It's a reminder that independence was just the starting point.
A journey of nation building continues.
It's a journey with all its complexities and challenges.
And its triumphs. And honestly, the more you learn about it, the more you realize just how much this period continues to resonate today.
So listeners, as you go and explore the resources we've provided, we want to leave you with a thought. Imagine you were designing a course on this topic. What case study would you absolutely have to include? What story would you feel compelled to tell? Think about it, and let's continue the conversation.
Let's do it.